Did you find a need? Did you find a vacuum?
National Educational Television presents The Dissenters. Conversations with the editors and publishers of political opinion magazines. This week, William F. Buckley, Jr., editor of National Review, a conservative publication, and host of his own syndicated television program, Firing Line. Interviewed by Donald Fauser.
Circumstances not oriented journalistically at all.
Considered as the editor of National Review and on your program Firing Line, to be considered one of the major dissenters in the United States today. And I wonder if you'd spell out some of the areas in which you dissent most avidly with consensus society, with the United States domestic policies today, and or foreign policies.
Well, beginning with the domestic point, it seemed to me reasonably clear that in the past 40 or 50 years, there was a bifurcation, and politically, people began to do what H.L. Mencken called substitute political for economic means of self-aggrandizement. That is to say, there was a sort of a dawning consciousness of the political instrumentality by which people could vote wealth to themselves, provided somebody got around to creating a surplus. And that this had the effect of undoing the sort of a generic liberalism, which was probably the most striking event of 400 or 500 years earlier, namely the dawning realization by individuals that they could govern themselves, that they could strike out for themselves, that they could make decisions that affected their own lives. And this seemed to me a centripetalization, a social centripetalization, which would cut the whole energy circuit of civilizations and keep people from maintaining the kind of self-dependence that results in creativity and in freedom. And it's that trend, I think, that conservatism has been very much alert to.
You feel, then, that the profit motive is a more natural motivation for man to aspire than for him to try to do this collectively in a political way?
I wouldn't accept your formulation, because there's nothing wrong with the collectivity so long as you have a total acquiescence in it. If you and I decide jointly that we want to stroll down Park Avenue together, there's nothing wrong with considering ourselves as a collectivity engaged in that particular pursuit. But the trouble is, the democratic practice at some point starts counting noses. And if you and I and Mr. Briggs here decide to do that, and we decide that the majority shall decide whether we stroll down Park Avenue or do something else, then instantly we are coercing a somebody. And the problem of a democratic society in terms of the libertarian paradigm is the minority that doesn't want to go along. Now, I don't take myself any satisfaction out of coercing a minority to go along when it doesn't choose to go along, unless it's absolutely necessary for the safety of the community. But it seems to me that presumption, the presumption in right of the individual to do what he wants to do, is simply widely disregarded in our society. Labor unions, of course, being a classic example.
But one manifestation I see here is such thing as the graduated income tax, and what indeed you're doing there is to take away from a few and give to the many for the public good. Now, it would seem to me that if we were to follow your philosophy logically, we wouldn't have such a thing as graduated income tax.
Absolutely not. I think that the graduated income tax is an institutional form of continuing class warfare. In the first place, I think people don't understand, a lot of people don't understand, that the kind of money that's drained from the rich as a result of the steeply progressive tax is totally exiguous. It doesn't amount to anything at all. If you take all of the money raised between, let's say, the 50% level and the 91% level, which is where it stood a couple of years ago, it amounted to less than $1.5 billion, i.e. In the vicinity of 1.25% of the national budget. So it isn't as though you need that money. What you seem to need is to penalize people for making a lot of money. Now, it seems to me that one of the blessings of equality is that people ought to be equally free to make money and to keep the money they earn, subject to the exactions that are necessary to take in order to run society. Now, if one could say, well, society simply can't proceed without that money, then you might appeal to the authority of the previous criterion I gave, namely the safety of the state. But this, as I say, is completely missing. You find in the rhetoric of the left, not that the money is needed, but that they just don't want anybody like H.L. Hunt to have whatever the hell his income is, $100 million a year. Now, I think most things about Mr. Hunt are deplorable, but I just don't think it's any of my business to build laws whose function is to victimize somebody that I happen not to find totally admirable.
Well, but the question, I guess, is if you're to try and have any kind of equalitarianism in society, where are you going to get the money to build roads, to...
Here's another thing about it. Another thing that's not widely realized is that in any generally affluent society, for instance our own, it is almost always the poor man who's paying. That is to say, the burden of taxation falls most squarely on the shoulders of the lower middle class. The secretaries, the subway workers, the elevator people, they are carrying the lion's share of the load, and always will, because a society is never going to become so affluent that there will be enough Rockefellers and H.L. Hunts around to carry anything like the load of our government, which is now, as you know, in the vicinity of $150, $160 billion a year when you count in state revenue.
But
now, Professor Friedman has shown that with the exception of one or maybe two of our grandiose state welfare and federal welfare programs, they actually have the effect of subsidizing the middle class at the expense of the lower class. If you like, just one example, free education in New York. Now, it is absolutely predictable that anybody who goes to college in New York is going to have a higher salary, a higher income by the time he's 25, 30 years old than, for instance, the average taxi driver or the average elevator operator. And yet, we've got this free tuition imperative here. And the net effect is the ironic one, that poorer people are being made to take sacrifices for the advancement of richer people. Now, this is one of those ironies which, in a curious sort of a metaphysical sense, is almost built in to any redistributionist system. Russia, you know, where we're going to have real equality, where we're going to have the paradise of the working class. What do you have there? You have a second lieutenant makes 10 times as much money as a private, whereas in the United States it's the ratio of 3 to 1. You have banks paying 12% interest for people's savings. These, as I say, are ironies that tend to happen when a society overreaches what are its proper ambitions. Its proper ambitions are really to get out of the way.
Well, that's only to say, really, that the Soviet Union has failed, and but it's not necessary that other countries fail in the same approach.
I don't know one that hasn't. People always say Sweden. Let's look at Sweden. That's the successful socialist haven. Well, the trouble with pointing to Sweden is that there are no, in a scientific sense, controls. How would Sweden have fared if they didn't have this heavy taxation, if they didn't have this government participation in so many enterprises? I think Sweden has proved that democratic socialism is possible under certain conditions, and this I grant. But I don't think that Sweden has proved at all that this is a means by which to attain the highest form of civilization, let alone the highest form of general affluence. You
have stated in the past that the federal government is most adept at collecting taxes, but not at dispersing them.
Oh, I was quoting Moynihan.
That's what you
my
were.
My new mentor.
Well, yes, that's a strange bedfellow. Do you agree with
You
this?
understand, he's sharing my bed, not I his.
You think he's moving?
Well, he's a very honest man. He's a rugged, as I said about him before, he's a PT 101 liberal. Actually wears it, you know. And he considers himself a liberal, but he also believes that the whole function of liberalism is its claims to rationality and pragmatism, and the rationality, the pragmatism shows that many of the pretensions of modern liberalism simply don't work out. One of them being, for instance, the notion that the Great Society could actually reach into every ghetto in the country and sort of re-stimulate a self-generating ethos that was going to sort of drag everybody out of power. It doesn't work. And it was Moynihan also, no, I guess it was Goodwin, who said, we have to face it, we liberals, that the conservatives came by something intuitively that we liberals have needed to get by the force of intellection, namely the suspicion of big government. So I think it is true that everybody from Bobby Kennedy to Goodwin, Moynihan, people all of a sudden discovering the last couple of years things that they thought Goldwater was a lunatic for affirming even as recently as 3 or 4 years ago.
This is you have mentioned in the National Review the use of corporations, especially insurance companies, in helping to rebuild slums. I wonder if you'd speak to that. What you see as a cooperation or coordination between federal government and private industry here. Do you see that as a step in the right direction?
Well, only in the sense that the federal government has been the principal inhibiting source for the development of public housing, and that is to say, it has exercised a negative influence. How? In 2 ways. One, by granting monopoly privileges to labor unions. The cost of construction, for instance, in New York City has gone up 14% per year. Now, how in the hell do you expect poor people to build houses that they can afford to pay for if it increases by 14% plus what you need to do to borrow the money? There's 21% per year, mind you. Now, I'm all in favor of electricians making as much money as they can possibly make, but I'm not in favor of their making money by the force of oligopolistic extractions on the community. I think that other people, even if they're Negroes, ought to be allowed to be electricians, and plumbers and bricklayers, and yet in point of fact we know that New York City is a union town, as I assume Boston is, as most towns are, and are protected as such by, who do you know, our old friend, the federal government. We also know that the federal government's tax structure is so heavy as necessary to be accounted for by the building trades industry. It's all very well to say let's have higher and higher taxes, but inevitably, of course, those taxes are passed along to the consumer. And my point is that it's extraordinary how well, in fact, American enterprise has acted even under the strain of that particular overhead, but it has meant that people are paying an awful lot of money for housing that they needn't otherwise pay. There is, of course, a third factor, and Henry George, of course, I think had the most sublime intuition concerning it, and that is that land is the one non-expansible element in that particular equation leading to wealth, which is why I myself am in favor of extremely high taxation aimed at land speculation.
But the argument, I guess, is if the unions earn more money, and if they charge more money for buildings, that indeed the economy must be able to bear this cost, or somewhere it would stop.
Well, somewhere it has stopped. Ask the people who are, the 4 or 5 families who share single rooms in Harlem, whether it stopped. And the answer is, of course, it did, as far as they're concerned. They can't get, quotes, decent housing for the price that they are able to pay. And one of the reasons they can't is because it can't be produced. One of the reasons it can't be produced is because electricians can be making $20, $25 an hour. And one of the reasons they're making $20, $25 an hour is because you and I, if we wanted to become electricians, would find it very, very difficult to crack that union. It's paternalistic, it's self-protected, and it simply aborts the whole processes of supply and demand, which should make it attractive for people to become electricians and plumbers and bricklayers, considering that they are in short supply.
Let me ask you, if I can, a rather hypothetical question. That is, that if you had your druthers, what would you rather have done in this country? what kind of a form of federal government-state relationship would you see? How effective, how influential would the federal government be in the lives of people? And how much of this would be, of what is now federal function, would be absorbed by states and or local communities?
You ask awfully cosmic questions.
Well, what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is in a rather general way what you see wrong with the country today, and as a dissenter, indeed, in this country, how you would change it, how you would alter it.
Well, I have to answer, of course, theoretically, and theoretically, I think the best articulation of a sound principle of government was done by the popes in encyclicals dating back to Rerum Novarum on a principle they call subsidiarity. And the principle of subsidiarity says the following, that nothing should be undertaken by government which can be done by a private association, and nothing should be undertaken by a higher echelon of government that can be undertaken by a lower echelon of government. So that applying that test to the federal government, you ask yourself, all right, now, what is the reason why Washington, D.C. should be financing a study of juvenile delinquency in New York City? The answer is, of course, none at all. No reason at all, at least by that standard. However, you run into this difficulty, and that is that since the federal government has developed this wonderful gathering system, tax gathering system, and tends to preempt the taxable income, can the state of New York or the city of New York or other states of the Union afford themselves to put up the money to attack problems that are distinctly local? So you see a situation in which the federal government has got to exercise a self-inhibiting influence. I think it's rather a pity that Congress doesn't exert itself more and simply cut down the uses of money, or else lease their money-raising facilities to the states, in effect, the Heller Plan, or whatever you want to call it, in order to return money to the states with which they themselves can undertake these functions.
Well, one of the reasons that the federal government, it seems anyway, that one of the reasons the federal government assumed so much power was simply because there was a feeling that states were not, in fact, solving their problems.
Yeah. Well,
I'm not sure that they've done any better.
It's an interesting observation because, among other things, it completely challenges one's central faith in democracy. If an individual state isn't solving a problem, it may be because, A, that state doesn't consider it a problem worth solving, or at least worth solving at the price of heavy taxation or at the price of a particular kind of legislation, or it may be that the particular state feels that it is so impoverished on April the 16th of every year as to leave them without the resources to solve that particular problem. Now, one of the difficulties, of course, with interventionist government of the kind that we have in the federal government is that they're always discovering problems and they're always discovering rights. And of course, you can't discover a problem without discovering sort of a duty to solve it. And you can't discover a right without discovering somebody else's correlative obligation. And this, in part, tends to be to result from the kind of millenniarism that is identified with utopian liberalism. And it's also, in part, however, the grubby demands of politics. Arthur Schlesinger was wandering around the country in the late 50s, terror with a sort of a jaded concern over the fact that people weren't dissatisfied enough. And he pointed to all sorts of dissatisfactions which he wanted to transform from abstract dissatisfactions into felt dissatisfactions. And the whole notion was, of course, to spur the government on into trying to decide some new means by which to seduce the support of the voters, because this is, of course, a power situation. And they're always going to find something to do. What is the Democratic platform going to offer the people in, 1976? Free what? And yet don't we know almost instinctively that they're going to have to think of some free something to offer us on into the future?
Well, the question...
This means discovering problems.
Well, that's true.
Your false teeth, for instance,
but the
is
problem
going to be discovered by government, by the Democratic Party in 1776.
That may be. The problem I see, you see, is that if the federal government is best at raising money, then it must also disperse that money somehow, even if it were to disperse it to the states. Then the question:
why not raise it in the first place?
Why not raise it in the first place? Well, yeah. No, but that's an interesting point, you see. But the problem is that what you say is that the states don't see what needs to be done. I guess what I see happening in the United States is a gradual homogenizing of the country, so that there is less difference between New England, Massachusetts, and Alabama in the South, and that somehow disbursements have to be made to try and equalize the opportunities in those various disparate parts of the country.
Why?
This is what I see as happening in the homogenized, because it seems to me that by and large, in the way they voted, people believe that this is the way.
No, they don't. They don't believe it at all. You know why they don't believe it? Because the overwhelming majority of the voters really believe that there is a spontaneously generating dollar in Washington, D.C. And this to me is so manifest as to be a political certitude. In New York City, simultaneously, the same constituency will instruct its local legislators to say no to more taxes for schools this year, and they'll instruct their federal legislators to pass a federal aid to education bill, which has the effect of taxing 3 times as many dollars from them, only 1/3 of which are remitted to them, as would be taxed if they went into it as a process of auto-taxation. Now, if you were to say to the people of New York, look, the net effect of this proposed legislation is to take money from you and simply give it to Alabama or Mississippi or Hawaii or whoever. And I think it's awfully philanthropic of you, and we really do appreciate it. Now let's proceed with the business. Do you think that they would be instructing their legislators to do that? The answer is no, they wouldn't. If they actually understood the economic mechanics of what it is they were doing, they would probably say no. Now, maybe they should say yes, and under circumstances they should say yes. But it's also true that our concern is for quality education. Who really says that New York can benefit Mississippi more by shipping money on down there or by raising the level of New York education? I think a very good case can be made for the latter rather than the former. See what I mean?
Yes, I do.
You know, the idea of egalitarianism in education neglects the fact that the quality of education in New York is something that might ultimately redound to the benefit of Mississippi infinitely more than, as I say, simply a truckload of dollars going down there every month or so.
I think the only argument I could think would be that the disparity between educational levels in both of these places would lead to major dissatisfaction on the part of the people in Mississippi.
Good. That's what we want. Precisely the first step to progress is major dissatisfaction.
It seems to me that maybe then you'll get the kind of situation you find in the ghettos today.
No. If you get major dissatisfaction, you get things like reform. But you see, one of the troubles with Mississippi, for instance, is that so obsessive is the federal spending problem that allocations are made with reference to it. If you get Washington, D.C., and says to the legislature of Mississippi, look, we will put in $9 for every buck you put up for highway building. Well, there's an enormous temptation to have highways, great big superhighways running from nowhere to nowhere, because it's a way of getting 10 to 1 on your money, in effect. Well, but that means that they do have to put that $1 up, and they put so many of those $1 up to claim those $9 that they tend to neglect that which they would otherwise perhaps not neglect, such as education.
Can you tell me what the National Review's stand on the Vietnam War is, indeed, in the confrontation overseas with communism?
Well, we have supported the war, not enthusiastically, but for different reasons, as you would suppose, from the reasons that, say, liberals unenthusiastically support the Vietnam War. Our notion is that it is strategically unintelligible to get that excited about Vietnam unless Vietnam relates to a worldwide situation, and that it makes schizophrenics of us all, on the one hand, to proceed against Vietnam on that assumption, and on the other hand, to cozy up as we have been to the Soviet Union as though it represented no threat conceivable or potential at all. If Vietnam is something to worry about, it's something to worry about because it is part of a worldwide movement. If it isn't part of a worldwide movement, we have no more reason purifying the politics of South Vietnam than we do those of Papa Doc's Haiti. In fact, a good deal less, considering that Haiti is close to our own shores.
But you find that it is?
Yes, I think there's no question about it, that the invasion of South Vietnam is a part of the general exuberance of the communist movement, which has got to be checked. And I think Mr. Rusk a while ago made a very, very good point, that all those people who worry about Lyndon Johnson's credibility gap should do a little thinking about America's credibility gap. If, in fact, we make promises, and we shouldn't make any promises that don't relate to our own security, and then fail to redeem them, what kind of a credibility gap are we going to have as a potential ally?
Well, what about the threat of the Soviet Union? Do you see a threat of the Soviet Union and an East Europe still?
Yes, sure. I think you'd feel one rather keenly if you happen to be one of its slaves. You mean, do I as an American
But the
feel
slaves are less slaves. All I'm trying to get at is if there has not been a change.
They're less slaves, yeah. They're somewhere between, say, the Greek slaves and the Roman slaves in terms of the kind of freedom that they exercise. But, of course, I feel a threat. I feel a threat whenever anybody that I don't control has hydrogen bombs that can land over my roof. And it seems to me indisputable that the Soviet Union has such bombs, indisputable that they continue to maintain a military machine at an extraordinary cost in terms of their own level of living, and that they presumably do that because they are fired to do that by something. Well, what that something is, of course, is an aggressive imperialistic ideology, a Weltanschauung, which incorporates in its future not only designs for the people of the Soviet Union, but designs on you and me.
What do you propose as alternative policies in this area?
Well, the alternative policy, it seems to me, is to make it quite clear that people don't fuss with the security of the free world with impunity. It seems to me clear that if we descended resonantly and devastatingly on people who do that kind of thing, that people wouldn't do that kind of thing in the future. It seems to me that the dilemma in Cuba is a brilliant example of the perversity with which we accomplish things. In order to persuade the Soviet Union to withdraw missiles that it brought there in the first instance, we promised never to liberate Cuba, so that the status quo ante was not restored. But on the contrary, the Soviet Union, in effect, we forwarded the Monroe Doctrine in such a way as to protect Soviet interests in this hemisphere. Now, if we had made it clear by moving decisively against Castro that this kind of thing isn't going to happen, if we had made it clear by moving decisively against communists in Southeast Asia, using primarily, of course, Asian manpower to do that, then we would have made clear lessons that would last perhaps over a period of decades and generations. We learned this from Lord Castlereagh at the Congress of Vienna, and we learned it previously under the Roman Empire. Nemo me licessit impunere. Nobody moves against me with impunity. And this is the responsible way for essentially not an imperial power, but a power that has imperial responsibilities to act.
But the problem now is that there are two imperial powers, really, and it's a standoff.
I know, no, it's not. It's only a standoff, but I'm not advocating at this point because I think it's unfeasible to do so. Is a war of liberation, and I think that one has to recognize the more or less de facto sovereignty of the Soviet Union over its own territories. There was a time when I think we could have secured the freedom of Poland. I think at this particular moment it is simply unlikely as a historical fact that we can affect the freedom of Poland.
This is NET, the National Educational Television Network.